Hi, thank you. Do you think that data sometimes doesn't make a distinction between white Hispanics and non-white Hispanics, and that might be skewing some of the trends that we might be seeing, like for, let's say, Latinos voting for the GOP or something?
I don't know if it's skewing it. I mean, there has been a growing amount of research because the census says that Hispanic is its own category, an ethnic category. And so I don't know if you've ever filled out a census. You will soon. It'll say, are you Hispanic or not? And then it'll ask you, regardless of how you answer, what is your racial identification. So these are considered by the government to be completely separate things, even though there's not necessarily a lot of evidence that we, the American people, necessarily understand these kind of complicated distinctions between ethnicity and race. The percentage of the Latino population that answers white varies from about 40 to 50% on different censuses. There has not been, I think, a lot of evidence to suggest that this is sort of a particularly meaningful kind of distinction. So there has been some work that's looked at this and said, is this a distinct group? I think it speaks to the complexity of the Latino population, though, that not all Latinos are the same, that there are different sort of, not just politics, but just in terms of how people see themselves, in terms of their everyday lives. I think there are important distinctions within this to make something like the Latino vote be a word that, what does that even mean? It almost becomes like the white vote or, the American vote. I mean, there's so many sort of things that are going on within it that I think it's just, another point about how the complexity of the Latino population makes it difficult to have these simple projections.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for coming out. You mentioned that hypothetically that if they did not vote, it would not make that big of a substantial difference in terms of President Trump winning the election. My question to you is, as we look forward to the 2020 election, do you find it concerning that there are candidates out there who are trying to pander to the Hispanic vote and trying different tactics in, getting the Hispanic vote and how they perceive, being creative and using creative outreach initiatives to get the complete approval of the Hispanic vote, despite, them overall being a small fraction of the entire voting population?
Well, you mentioned pander. I would just say it's outreach. I mean, politicians are always trying to outreach. They're often trying to micro-target. They're trying to find specific groups here and there that can make a difference here and there. I think it's actually good for Latinos to have the parties competing for their vote. I think that it would be bad for Latinos if just only one party was competing for their vote, because then you become what's called a captured constituency. You don't have anywhere to go. I think it's best for Latinos to be in that kind of position where there are people who are campaigning for them. And also, just in terms of their political influence too. I mean, sometimes just the reputation for being influential can make you influential. So if people think that demography is changing and that this is going to really sort of shape American politics, it may cause both parties to go out and try to compete for them, which would be good for Latinos, because then you would have both parties robustly making the case for why you should support one or the other. So I think that it's not bad. It's never bad for people to try to go and get the Latino vote. I think that a lot of people who try to do it don't understand the complications of it. I think they have this kind of one-dimensional idea of what a Latino voter is. And, and some people who have tried to appeal to Latino voters haven't done a very good job of it. There are a couple candidates right now, one or two I can think of, who have tried to appeal to Latino voters, but their poll numbers suggest that they're not very successful with anybody, let alone Latinos. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. They're in charge of calling on people, not me.
Thank you. So I am from Texas, like South Central Texas, and one of the things that I've kind of seen is, I guess, how different, or how vast, I guess, kind of the Latino group is, and there's so many different countries that those individuals can come from. And I guess in my own personal experience, I've seen how somebody from South America has very different views on certain issues than somebody from Central America and somebody from Mexico and somebody from Cuba. Yep. My own girlfriend, her family is from like Monterrey, and they're legal residents, but they're incredibly anti-immigrant in a lot of ways. And I'm like, wow, that's something that's somewhat surprising. So is there like one or two issues that are somewhat shared kind of across the Latino group, something like entrepreneurship or some others perhaps that you might have seen?
Latinos are a very optimistic population, so they very much believe in like the American dream. They believe in sort of going out and being successful, and so I think that's why George W. Bush and his kind of opportunity, be entrepreneurial, don't let the government tamp down on your ambitions, sort of free you up to go get the American dream and move into the middle class. There's a lot of evidence for that. Latinos are highly patriotic, just as much as anybody else is. So when we're looking at sort of the fundamentals of Latinos' attitudes toward America, capitalism, freedom, they're pretty high. You mentioned Cubans, and there are other groups too that have different opinions. It's true, it's another complication I could have put in. I felt I barely had time to get through the slides that I did, even at high speed, so I couldn't get everything in there. One issue where Latinos aren't really that liberal is immigration. Everybody thinks that Latinos are some sort of open border kind of advocates, but they're absolutely not at all. The first major polling of Latinos in the 1980s showed that Latinos are actually surprisingly opposed to more immigration. I mean, not a majority, but there was a surprisingly large percentage of the population that was not supportive of more migration. So when you look at the immigration issue, what you see is that Latinos as a policy issue, and this is part of one of the readings that I had you look at, immigration policy versus immigration politics. When you're talking about immigration in a good faith kind of policy discussion, should we have more, should we have less, should they be family preference, should they be skilled, Latinos' views actually start to look a lot like a lot of Americans' views. They're not just in favor of open borders for everybody. When you turn immigration into a political football, though, that sort of indicts all Latinos as maybe not really being true Americans, then I think the immigration issue starts to turn around and becomes a very different kind of thing. And that works to the advantage of Democrats because it gives them an issue. So yes, I think there are lots of complications within the Latino community. National origin group is certainly one of them. Immigration is another, but not very well-known kind of difference within there. I think a lot of Latino groups have historically not really wanted to talk about that. I think there's been I think some people want the Latino population to be more liberal than it actually is, and that this gets in the way of some of our understanding of what the actual true Latino population is, as we can tell from surveys. And some electoral results too, like 2016.
Good morning. Thank you for coming to speak with us. My question is, how much do you think that U.S. foreign policy towards Latin America changes or shifts the Latino vote in any substantial way towards like specific countries, but also just with the region in general?
I mean, I feel like that there's been research on this about Latin American countries trying to use their diasporas to influence American foreign policy, and there hasn't been a lot of that. There has been research on are Latinos sort of interested in home country politics, and the answer to that is not really very much. Even in countries that have the right to vote in other countries, like Mexico. So for people who could have voted in Mexico, if you come to the United States, you can vote in Mexican elections. The turnout among the Mexican eligible voter, the Mexican citizen eligible voter population in the U.S. in Mexican elections is incredibly small. Incredibly small. Yes, you have to do it by international registered mail and pay $7 or whatever, but it's an incredibly small percentage. So. And if you look at maybe like remittances, money sent home to relatives or through hometown associations to rebuild the village church or to do other kinds of even social projects, you find that that drops off dramatically after the first generation. And sometimes I talk about that with my students at UT about, people will say, well, my parents send remittances to my grandparents. And I say, well, are you going to send remittances? And they're like, what, to my cousins? They know, it's got nothing to do with them. Mexico is it's a sentimental kind of thing. When the Mexican soccer team plays Germany, they're all for Mexico, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything in any kind of political terms. So I think that the connection between Latin American countries, whether we're talking about sort of U.S. foreign policy or we're talking about Latin American countries through the diaspora influencing that, has been pretty minimal. I mean, obviously Cuba has been a big exception to that, to Venezuela possibly today. But it's a relatively small-ish group. And so I think that there are possibilities here and there, but in general, probably not very strong connections.
Hi, thank you. On the flip side of that, I was going to ask, how do you think that this shift in domestic policies or ramping up of deportations and things like what happened in El Paso, how that maybe has a shift in the Latino populace in their opinions about the candidates for 2020, and if that will have a lasting impact or not?
I think it can have a short-term kind of impact because, in general, if you just ask Latinos, what are the most important issues to you? a lot of people assume that it's all sort of Latino specific, like immigration or bilingual education. But in point of fact, the Latino policy agenda looks pretty much exactly like that of everybody else in America. Jobs, the economy, foreign policy, war and terror for a while, war in Iraq. If you look at all the policy issues of the day, what Latinos themselves tell you in an open-ended kind of way is pretty much what everybody else says matters. Immigration is actually, in normal times, pretty low on the Latino policy agenda, just like it's pretty low for most Americans. Now, there are time periods when immigration comes back up onto the agenda. It does that for whites, it does that for Latinos. And that can have, I think, a short-term political effect in a kind of immigration politics kind of way as opposed to an immigration policy way. But I don't think there's been any evidence that this sort of plays out in a very long-term way. So there are some people who will say, well, there's lots of first-time voters in the Latino electorate. They may sort of be, they may be politically socialized in this kind of unique time period, and so they might perhaps become more democratic or more liberal on immigration or something along those lines. I mean, we haven't necessarily sort of seen that in the past. I think that's more of a claim than it really is an empirically demonstrated fact. And so I think that the immigration politics brings the issue onto the agenda, and that can shift Latino and non-Latino views to some degree. But we've also got to remember just how anchored most American politics is in the fundamentals. It takes a lot. We sometimes think that elections are about issues, but it's actually hard to find a lot of issue effects in political science. The fundamentals, socioeconomic status, partisan affiliation, religion, age, gender, there are all sorts of things that are going into the vote. And issues on the whole don't always play the kind of role that we think they do. They certainly can, like a recession or a war. I mean, these things have mattered. But other kinds of policy issues that step below that haven't quite had the kind of political effects that we sometimes think they might. So it's possible that for some people, yes. But in the long term, I'm a little skeptical that that's going to really sort of change the game in politics in any kind of meaningful way, given all the other things we've talked about.
Would you argue that single-issue voters are a captured electorate over a long period of time? So you talk about how the Latino population maybe is more dispersed in their voting patterns than people would think. So would you say that that means they are less likely to be single-issue voters? And then do you think that that is destiny? So if you care about one specific issue, whether it's migration or abortion or gun rights or something else, you're consistently going to vote with that side of the equation every time, all the time going forward?
Well, I think there's a couple things that are going on here in this question, which is good. I think that there are people who are single-issue voters, or at least, and that doesn't necessarily move them to one party or the other, but it often does. So, abortion, or there are classic groups like farmers, teachers. There are gun owners. There are a variety of types of groups in the population that seem to have some distinctive positions that maybe put them into conflict a little bit with some of their kind of other fundamentals. So there are certain populations out there that do seem to be single issue, but they're not. But there's a whole variety of them, and there's lots of other things that are sort of going on politically. I think that are Latinos a single issue group? I don't think they really sort of fall into that. I think that's a little separate from the captured constituency argument, which is more about which group is trying to recruit them. So if one party says we love you and the other party says, we don't like you at all, then you're in a sense a captured constituency, because where are you going to go? I mean, you still might vote for the other party, but you're not being asked to, and you're not being given any particular reason. Single issue, no. I think that Latinos are, as I said a little bit earlier, they're kind of like New Dealers. They see politics in kind of, some people want more government social programs and the taxes to pay for them, and some people want less. And over time, that's going to shift, because a lot of that is closely correlated with your own kind of socioeconomic status. So to the degree that Latinos become, as they are, more successful, more integrated into the economy, their positions on those kinds of issues that they actually seem to prioritize when they think about their party affiliation, that's going to shift, and it's going to shift them more toward the Republican side. The other single issues, I think they matter to some degree. So, for example, the strong correlation between sort of evangelical Pentecostal religious affiliation and the GOP, that's not sort of an issue exactly. It's a whole variety of things that are going into the way that the parties have divided the religious issue space. So I think there are a lot of fundamentals that are going on, but I don't think of it as single issues like immigration or any other kind of issue is going to sort of come onto the agenda and really sort of change how Latinos engage in politics. I think it's going to be a gradual shift that reflects more of these kind of fundamental views of the parties.
Hi, thank you so much. This is more of a broader question with regards to just globalization and just people relocating to the United States from overseas, from all over the globe. I see that it is super difficult to actually be able to stay in the United States. And even after enrolling in a really good university, we see students getting literally kicked out of the country after going to college here. I moved to the United States about 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, and I received my green card after being here for 2 months, which is like super quickly, actually. And I see so many people staying here for very long periods of time and just not being able to receive that green card. Can you just elaborate a little bit more? This is a broader question, but can you just elaborate a little bit more on what you think can be done or should be done differently with regards to that green card process and just integrating and then eventually being able to vote and just, yeah.
Okay, so about either sort of getting a green card and then going from green card to citizen, as I said, it takes a long time for someone to go from non-citizen to legal permanent resident if they qualify through a relatively limited number of ways, and then to go from there on to becoming a citizen. It's not like it's necessarily their fault. I mean, there's a bureaucracy that's involved, there's paperwork, there's documents, there's a price for citizenship, there's a citizenship exam, there's a whole variety of things that get in the way of that, and so it's a policy decision. Do you want to make that easier? Should it be faster? Should process times could be made faster if they hired more people to process them? You could change the fee of naturalization to 0. I mean, you could do all sorts of things, or to become a citizen. I mean, you could do lots of things in order to change that process. I don't know if in the time that I have here with Josh about to pull me off that I can sort of tell you comprehensively what we ought to do with immigration reform in America. I feel like that's a completely separate topic, but it's a policy choice. There are lots of options out there, and there's all sorts of different opinions, as you know, within sort of ideologies, within conservatism, within liberalism versus libertarianism and others. So there's lots of ideas out there. I don't think I can give you like a good one right now, but the obstacles and the requirements that are in the process contribute to the complexities that we talked about earlier, about how difficult it is to take immigrants and then have them become citizens and voters that make an electoral difference later on. That's just one part of the whole complication of this.
Thank you very much, David.
Thank you.